Alright, so the value of complex numbers. Now, exactly with real numbers, you can find the absolute value of a real number. That's just the distance between any real number and 0. And it actually works kind of the same for complex numbers as well, except you're actually finding the distance between a complex number and the origin, which is 0, 0 on the coordinate plane. But here, you can find absolute value in terms of numbers. So right now, I have the absolute value formula. These vertical lines right here, they stand for absolute value. And what I'm doing right here is I'm finding the absolute value of a complex number, a plus bi. Now, as you remember, the real part of a complex number is going to be that a. It's not attached to the I. But the imaginary part is b, and that's always going to be attached to the I. And what we do is we square the two parts, so we get a squared and b squared. We add them together, and then we take the square root at the very end. And we can rewrite this in terms of real parts and imaginary parts. So if a is the real part, I can write that as REZ. It stands for the real part of z. And for b, since that's the imaginary part of z, I can write that as IMZ, and that just stands for the imaginary part of z. And basically, I square them, I add them up, and then I take the square root at the very end. So let's take a look at this example. Here, I want to find the absolute value of 4 plus 3i. So here, my real part is going to be 4. So I can say the real part of z is going to be 4. Also, the imaginary part is going to be 3. That's always the number attached to the I. So I say Im of z is 3. So now that I know what the real part is, and I know what the imaginary part is, I can put all that into my formula, and I can find out the absolute value, also known as the modulus. So, the absolute value of z is the same thing as the absolute value of 4 plus 3i, and then I get my square root going. Now the a is going to be 4, that's the real part, so I'm going to have 4 squared. I put the 4 inside parentheses, and we're going to add the imaginary part, which is also parentheses, which is the 3, and then I square that. And then we just see what happens. So, if I square 4, I'm going to get 16. I'm going to get 16. And if I square the 3, I'm going to get a 9. So now, under the square root symbol, I have 16 plus 9. And I know that 16 plus 9 is going to give me 5. So this is actually going to be equal to the square root of 25, which is 5. So that's going to be my absolute value. So what the absolute value does is it takes any complex number and it converts it into being a real number. So if you want to think about it in a really analytical way, you could think about it as a function that maps every single complex number to a real number. But of course, that real number can't be negative, right? Because absolute value can never be negative. Okay? Let's look at this next example. I want to find the absolute value of negative 1 minus 2i. Just like before, I'm going to have a real part and I'm going to have an imaginary part. So my real part is going to be whatever's not attached to the I. So the real part is negative 1 for this one. And same way as last time, I can find the imaginary part, which is always attached to the I. This time it's going to be negative 2, because I have this negative out in front. So now I know what my A is going to be, I know what my B is going to be, and I can find the absolute value of Z. So the absolute value of Z is going to be equal to the absolute value of whatever the complex number is, negative 1 minus 2i, and then I put it into my formula that I have up here. So I'm going to have my square root symbol. I'm going to put my A in parentheses, which is negative 1, and I'm going to square that. Then I put my plus sign down, and now we look at the imaginary part, which is going to be the B up here. So my imaginary part is -2. I put that inside parentheses and I square it. And now I just work out whatever's below the square root symbol. Okay, so if I square a -1, that's the same thing as doing -1 times -1. And we know that's going to be a +1. So I start off with a +1. I bring down my plus sign. And now I square -2 to get +4. So I put the +4 right here. So now I add up what's under the square root symbol. 1 plus 4 is going to give me 5. So my answer at the end of this is going to be the square root of 5. The root of it and get a whole number. So I have to leave my answer like this, square root of 5. So that's absolute value. When you find absolute value, you're just using this formula, and it really just takes into account, what's the real part, what's the imaginary part, and it puts it in a nice formula for you to look at. Okay? So that's absolute value. I hope that helped you out today.